Would you marry your own brother if it was the only way to save your children, and would you still do it if you knew he would murder them on your wedding night? Picture this. You're standing beneath the towering marble columns of the Macedonian palace at Pella, your pulse thundering in your ears as incense coils through the summer air and golden oil lamps flicker like watchful eyes. You see Arsinoe II, one of the most powerful and ultimately tragic women in the hidden history of Egypt, adjusting the golden diadem on her brow, her fingers trembling not with fear, but with a rage so bitter it tastes like iron on her tongue. Around her, the air thrums with the chanting of priests calling upon Zeus and Hera, the divine siblings of Olympus, to bless this marriage, even as the gathered nobles draped in shimmering silk celebrate what they believe to be a triumphant alliance. But beneath the opulence and ritual beats the dark heart of an ancient royal scandal, a forbidden royal marriage that would shock even the gods, for Arsinoe is about to wed her own half-brother Ptolemy Keraunos, a man known among warriors as the Thunderbolt for his swiftness and cruelty, a man whose arms encircle her waist with possessive force, whose smile glitters like a knife poised above her throat. This union is no act of love, but a desperate chess move in the deadly game of the Ptolemaic dynasty, where blood ties are both weapon and chain, and where the price of power is often paid in blood. She stands here not for romance, but because she has no choice, driven by the ancient laws of survival that have shaped every queen who dared rule in this savage world. Her 3 sons from her first marriage are pawns on the board, threats to Keraunos' stolen throne, and though he whispers promises of safety and future crowns, Arsinoe sees the same hunger in his eyes that led him to spill royal blood before. And as the shadows dance over the marble floor, she knows that in the twisted corridors of ancient politics, there are no true gods, only mortals willing to sacrifice everything to become divine. Long before the night, Arsinoe II stood beneath the marble arches of Pella, dressed in bridal linen that felt more like a funeral shroud. She was merely a child wandering the sun-drenched courtyards of Alexandria, a city shimmering like a mirage at the edge of the Mediterranean, a city that held within its limestone walls both the promise of boundless glory and the seeds of deadly ambition. For this was no ordinary city, but the beating heart of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a place where the ancient gods of Egypt watched over marble palaces built by Greek conquerors, where incense curled in temple shadows and philosophers debated the nature of the cosmos, while merchants hawked spices and silk beneath towering obelisks. And though the streets bustled with scholars and soldiers, Arsinoe's earliest lessons were not of poetry or philosophy, but of power. Because even as a little girl, she understood that she was born into a world where royal blood was both a crown and a prison, and that the price of survival in a family forged by conquest and ruled by secrets was often paid in flesh and loyalty. And while the hidden history of Egypt whispers the names of powerful women like Cleopatra, few remember that it was Arsinoe II who first learned to walk the knife's edge between goddess and victim for her father. Ptolemy I Soter was no ordinary man, but one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals, the same man who carried Alexander's body from Babylon, the same man who carved out his own kingdom from the chaos after the conqueror's death, and whose legacy would shape a dynasty notorious for forbidden royal marriages and ancient royal scandals that would make even modern audiences gasp. And in the cool halls of the palace, where water murmured through marble fountains, young Arsinoe watched the adults around her play the brutal game of power, saw how smiles could hide daggers, and how alliances shifted like desert sand. And she learned that in the Ptolemaic dynasty, queens were not merely wives or mothers, but living symbols of legitimacy and divine favor, yet they were also pawns to be traded for treaties, exiled when convenient or sacrificed when politics demanded it. And as she listened to her stepmother Berenice whisper tales of goddesses who ruled kingdoms and sisters who married brothers to keep their bloodlines pure, Arsinoe realized that in Egypt, sibling marriage was not scandal, but sacred duty, echoing the union of Isis and Osiris. Yet she also knew the Greeks called such unions monstrous, a violation of natural law, and it was this collision of Greek disgust and Egyptian tradition that shaped her destiny from the moment she could speak, because in Alexandria, where ships arrived daily from distant shores carrying not just goods but rumors and secrets, A princess was never just a daughter, but a tool of empire. And even as Arsinoe gazed at the sun sparkling on the sea, part of her already sensed that one day she would have to wield beauty, cunning, and cruelty in equal measure if she hoped to survive. And though the poets would later sing of Cleopatra, it was Arsinoe II who first laid the groundwork for how a woman might seize power in a man's world, but destiny, as always, was already setting its pieces in place for the day when her father would offer her as a bride to a man older than her grandfather, a sacrifice for the survival of the Ptolemaic throne, a sacrifice that would lead her into marriages both monstrous and magnificent, and into a darkness from which she would emerge transformed into something far greater than a queen. And it is there on the eve of her first marriage that Arsinoe's story takes its next harrowing turn. So when Arsinoe II turned 15, the year the priests recorded as 300 BCE, the city of Alexandria held its breath, for the time had come for the princess whose bloodline carried both Greek ambition and Egyptian divinity to be transformed from a child of the palace into a bargaining chip in the chess game of empires. And though the poets would later dress it up in verses of destiny and beauty, the truth, hidden beneath layers of silk and incense, was that her father, Ptolemy III, was driven by the brutal mathematics of survival, and so he arranged a marriage that would ripple through the hidden history of Egypt and echo across the thrones of Greece and Thrace. For her husband-to-be was none other than Lysimachus, the king of Thrace, a man who had once ridden beside Alexander the Great from the dust-choked banks of the Indus to the marble gates of Babylon, a man over 55 years old whose scarred hands still bore the mark of a lion's claws, earning him the nickname that warriors whispered with a mixture of awe and dread, and to a girl whose eyes still shone with the innocence of youth. This grizzled king must have seemed like a figure carved from legend, terrifying and magnificent all at once. And as ships crowded the harbor of Sardis for the wedding feast, carrying ambassadors and spies from every corner of the fractured Hellenistic world, Arsinoe stepped into her fate wrapped in linen, dyed Tyrian purple, the color of queens and conquerors, her hair crowned with a diadem that caught the flicker of 1,000 oil lamps, while poets recited odes comparing her to Helen of Troy and Penelope the Faithful. Yet beneath the music and perfumed air, she felt the weight of every stare, knowing that her beauty was not her own, but the property of a dynasty desperate to secure its borders and crush its rivals. And though the musicians played harps and dancers spun in circles of glittering gold, Arsinoe tasted only ashes on her tongue, because she knew this was no union of hearts, but a contract written in flesh and sealed in blood, for this marriage was meant to bind Thrace to Egypt, to encircle their mutual enemies, and to create a line of heirs whose veins would carry both the wisdom of the Nile and the warcraft of Macedon. And even as Lysimachus slipped the ring onto her slender finger, his eyes calculating rather than tender, Arsinoe felt the first stirrings of a truth that would define the rest of her life. That in the Ptolemaic dynasty, queens were queens only, so long as they could outwit the daggers hidden behind every polite smile. And as the wedding feast stretched over 3 days with nobles toasting to alliances and drunk generals boasting of ancient battles, Arsinoe learned to smile while her mind raced, memorizing names, alliances, and the subtle shifts of power swirling around her, because she understood that beauty alone could not save her, that only cunning and patience might keep her children safe. And though her voice joined in the hymns sung for the newly wedded royal pair in her heart, she was already preparing for the next move on the chessboard of survival, knowing that the true game would begin not with wedding vows but with the birth of sons who might one day claim the throne. And thus, as the final echoes of music faded beneath the vaulted ceilings of Sardis, Arsinoe stood poised between girlhood and the brutal world of queenship, unaware that the choices made in this marriage would set her feet on a path leading to both unthinkable glory and unimaginable betrayal, a path that would carry her from the jeweled courts of Thrace to the blood-soaked halls of Macedonia, and into a destiny that even the gods might have feared. And it is here in the silent hours after the wedding torches burned low that Arsinoe's story begins its inexorable march toward tragedy and legend alike. It wasn't long after the echoes of the wedding hymns faded through the golden halls of Sardis that Arsinoe II began to understand that being a queen in the fractured Hellenistic world was far more than wearing jewels or basking in the glow of poets' verses, for as the new queen of Thrace, she stepped into a world teeming with hidden daggers and alliances as shifting as desert sands, and the very air of her husband's court hummed with whispers of ancient royal scandals and forbidden royal marriages, each rumor carrying the weight of potential war or sudden assassination. Because Lysimachus, though hailed as a veteran king whose sword had carved victories beside Alexander the Great, was a man now deep in his 50s, ruling over a kingdom hemmed in on all sides by enemies both foreign and domestic, and though his throne glittered with the spoils of decades of conquest, it sat upon fault lines ready to crack open at the slightest tremor, for to the north lay the Thracian tribes, fierce warriors eager for plunder, while to the east loomed the growing might of Seleucus the Fur, whose own ambitions stretched from Anatolia to the edges of India, and all around them circled the other Diadochi, the rival generals of Alexander's shattered empire, each waiting for a moment of weakness to strike, and Arsinoe, with eyes that had been trained since childhood to read the subtleties of power, quickly realized that in this lethal chess game, her own value lay not simply in her royal blood, but in her ability to maneuver through webs of intrigue, for within a year of her marriage, she was with child, and the birth of her son Ptolemy in 299. BCE was both triumph and new peril, because in the darkened corridors of power, a royal child was never simply a child, but a potential claimant to the throne. A living spark that could ignite a civil war, and even as she cradled her newborn in arms, scented with myrrh, Arsinoe's mind was already calculating how to protect him. Because Lysimachus, though he now called her queen, already had an heir, Agathocles, the son of an earlier marriage, and as the courtiers gathered beneath gilded ceilings to offer congratulations, Arsinoe felt the undercurrents shifting, saw the glances exchange between factions loyal to Agathocles, and those who whispered that only a queen of Egyptian blood could secure Thrace's future, and as music drifted over marble floors, she understood that each child she bore would deepen the fault lines beneath the throne, and yet even as danger closed in, Arsinoe's resolve hardened, for she remembered the hidden truths of the Ptolemaic dynasty, that queens could not merely be beautiful, they must be ruthless, cunning, willing to wield loyalty and treachery in equal measure. And it was in these early years in Thrace, surrounded by enemies who smiled with honeyed words while plotting poison in goblets, that Arsinoe began forging the steel that would one day allow her to survive betrayals, that would have destroyed any ordinary woman. And it is here, amid the flicker of torches in the grand halls of Lysimachus's court, that Arsinoe's quiet war began. A war fought not with swords but with secrets, a war that would soon explode into deadly consequences as the question of succession reared its serpent's head, and that question whispering in every corner of the palace would be the spark that lit the inferno to come, as we shall see in what happened next when Agathocles himself stepped into the crosshairs of fate. It was in those gilded halls of Thrace, beneath ceilings painted with scenes of Alexander's triumphs, that Arsinoe II found herself caught in a storm of palace conspiracies, and whispered betrayals for as her sons grew from babes swaddled in royal linen to boys with bright eyes and curious minds. The tension over who would inherit Lysimachus's fractured kingdom thickened like incense in a temple. And though the world outside saw only a queen draped in gold and amethyst, within the walls of the palace the reality was far more dangerous, because Agathocles, Lysimachus's eldest son from his first marriage, was a prince in his prime, a man hailed for his courage in battle, whose popularity among the nobles threatened to eclipse even that of the aging king, and the courtiers who circled like vultures could smell the coming bloodshed, for in the ruthless world of the Ptolemaic dynasty and its tangled web of alliances, the existence of Arsinoe's own sons, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Philip was a loaded weapon aimed straight at Agathocles' claim to the throne, and soon rumors began to swirl through the marbled corridors, rumors that Arsinoe was maneuvering to replace Agathocles with her own blood whispers, that she poured poison into her husband's ear with the soft voice of a loving wife while plotting the fall of his heir. And though some called it slander, born of jealousy, others believed it entirely. For they knew that in the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty, queens had often played the deadliest games of all, and whether or not Arsinoe truly conspired to bring Agathocles down, events soon unfolded with the savage logic of a Greek tragedy, because in 283 BCE accusations of treason fell like thunder, and Agathocles found himself seized and thrown into chains, condemned on evidence so thin that even the walls seemed to whisper that someone had engineered it from the shadows. And though historians would argue for centuries whether Arsinoe's hand guided this downfall, the effect was undeniable. For Agathocles was swiftly executed on his father's orders, his blood staining the legacy of a dynasty already drowning in ancient royal scandals and forbidden royal marriages. And as news of the prince's death rippled through the court, the nobles recoiled in horror, for Agathocles had been a warrior. They respected a leader who had marched beside his father in countless campaigns. And his execution shattered the fragile balance of power dividing the kingdom into factions. One that blamed Arsinoe as a foreign seductress who had bewitched the old king, and another that saw in her sons the future of Thrace's survival. And amid the hush of fear and rage, Arsinoe stood in her chambers, her face composed like polished marble, while inside her heart pounded with both triumph and terror, because she knew she had survived one threat only to ignite countless others. For the ghost of Agathocles would haunt her steps, and the kingdom now trembled on the brink of civil war, as old loyalties splintered and enemies gathered strength. And it is here in the smoking ruins of trust and blood that Arsinoe's path twisted once again toward a fate more dangerous than she had ever imagined, a fate waiting beyond the borders of Thrace, where her entire world would soon be upended by a clash of kings and by the fall of the man she once called husband, as we shall see when Lysimachus meets his final reckoning on the battlefield. And so it came to pass that in 281 BCE, the fragile tapestry of power Arsinoe II had woven in Thrace began to unravel with terrifying speed, for the execution of Agathocles, whether masterminded by her cunning or merely an accident of palace intrigue, had cracked the kingdom like glass under pressure. And Lysimachus, once the lion of Alexander's campaigns, now stood isolated atop a throne, ringed with suspicion and fear, his white hair hanging like snow over the scars of past wars, while across the border the eyes of another titan watched with predatory patience for Seleucus Nicator, last of Alexander's original bodyguard and builder of a vast empire stretching from Anatolia to the edges of India, saw in Thrace's chaos an opportunity to carve his name even deeper into the annals of the ancient royal scandals that littered the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty and its rival houses. And as rumors of civil war and noble conspiracies roiled through the marble corridors of the palace, Arsinoe found herself trapped in a palace turned into a gilded prison. For even as she nursed her youngest sons and listened to poets sing of divine queens and eternal empires, her mind churned with dread, knowing that the throne upon which she and her children depended was shaking on foundations built of blood and betrayal. And though Lysimachus tried to hold his kingdom together with proclamations and alliances, the truth was that his years of conquest had aged him, leaving a man whose sword arm was no longer as swift, whose eyes sometimes clouded with the fog of memory, and in the chill dawns as frost clung to the marble statues of Alexander that loomed over the courtyards, the old king gathered his legions for what would become his final gamble, for Seleucus had marched west with an army that glittered like a tide of steel under the winter sun, determined to avenge the murder of Agathocles and seize the riches of Thrace for himself. And Arsinoe, standing on the palace balcony, watched the endless lines of soldiers vanish into the gray horizon, her breath misting in the cold air as dread coiled in her chest, because she knew that this was no mere border skirmish, but a war that would decide not only the fate of kingdoms, but whether her sons would live or die. And in the weeks that followed, messengers raced back and forth carrying scraps of news soaked in blood, until at last word arrived that shattered everything Arsinoe had built at the Battle of Corupedium. Lysimachus fell in combat, his body pierced by spear thrusts from the men of Seleucus, and the throne of Thrace collapsed like a palace of cards, leaving Arsinoe a widow in a kingdom devouring itself. For now nobles who once knelt to her offered their loyalty to new masters, and whispers of ancient royal scandal rose louder than ever, branding her the foreign queen who had brought ruin to Thrace. And it is here, as smoke rises from burning cities and the shadows of the past close in, that Arsinoe faces the most desperate choice of her life, one that will set her on a perilous journey westward, as we shall see when she flees the ashes of a fallen kingdom with only her children and her relentless will to survive. In the smoldering aftermath of Lysimachus's death, as the banners of Seleucus fluttered over captured fortresses and Thrace dissolved into chaos, Arsinoe II found herself transformed almost overnight from a queen surrounded by courtiers and poets into a fugitive whose name was whispered in dark corners as both victim and villain of an ancient royal scandal. For the nobles who had once bowed before her now spat accusations that she was the foreign witch whose ambition had doomed their kingdom. And while the streets of her cities ran red with the blood of executions and vengeance killings, Arsinoe gathered her 3 sons in trembling arms and faced the grim truth that in the world of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a queen's crown was no shield against the knives of politics. And so she began a desperate flight westward, slipping out of the palace with only a handful of loyal attendants. And as she passed through the palace gates for the last time, the jeweled diadem that once proclaimed her Queen of Thrace hidden beneath a plain traveler's cloak, she felt the searing knowledge that the wealth and power she had amassed now meant nothing if it could not keep her children safe. And so, under the cover of darkness, Arsinoe's small caravan vanished into the night, winding through mountain passes where frost gleamed like shattered glass, and into valleys where the forests whispered with unseen dangers. For every mile brought new threats, soldiers loyal to Seleucus who scoured the roads for remnants of the old regime, brigands hungry for royal ransom, and spies eager to curry favor by delivering the woman blamed for Thrace's downfall. And though exhaustion dragged at her limbs, Arsinoe's mind remained razor-sharp, for she understood that survival was no longer merely about preserving thrones or alliances, but about keeping her sons alive. And the hidden truths of the Ptolemaic dynasty were branded into her very soul, that sometimes to save what mattered most, a queen must become invisible, must slip through the cracks of history like a ghost. And so, at each dusty village, Arsinoe changed identities, sometimes posing as a merchant's wife, sometimes as a pilgrim, seeking sacred mysteries, while her children learned to hold their tongues and keep their royal bearing buried beneath rough-spun clothes. And each dawn found Arsinoe staring eastward toward Alexandria, knowing that Egypt, the land of her birth and of the pharaohs whose blood ran in her veins, was now her only hope. And yet, even as she fled toward the promise of sanctuary, another shadow was rising to meet her. A man whose ambition burned as fiercely as any in the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty. A man whose path would soon collide with hers in a union that would shock even a world accustomed to forbidden royal marriages. For waiting across the sea was Ptolemy Keranos, the Thunderbolt, her own half-brother, who would offer Arsinoe both salvation and the deadliest snare of her life, as we shall see when the woman who had been Queen of Thrace becomes a pawn once again in the blood-stained game for Macedonia's throne. Across the swirling seas that separated the broken remnants of Alexander's empire, Ptolemy Keranos, known as the Thunderbolt, watched the collapse of Thrace with eyes as cold and sharp as the Macedonian winds. For he was a man forged in the same crucible of ambition and betrayal that had birthed so many ancient royal scandals and dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a prince whose very name meant lightning, whose swiftness and brutality were whispered of in soldiers' camps and royal courts alike. And while Arsinoe II fled with her sons through hidden valleys and silent roads, Keranos was weaving a web of power across Macedonia, seizing the throne in a daring coup that shocked even a world accustomed to forbidden royal marriages and blood-soaked successions. For after murdering Seleucus, the conqueror who had slain her husband Lysimachus, Keranos emerged as king, cloaking himself in the splendor of Alexander's legacy, while his hands still dripped with royal blood. And in those weeks when Arsinoe sought refuge from the collapsing world behind her, envoys arrived bearing letters sealed in red wax, each carrying words dipped in honey yet edged with steel, for Keranos offered not only safe passage and protection for Arsinoe and her children, but also a throne beside him, a chance to reclaim the glittering power that had been snatched from her grasp. And though every fiber of her being recoiled at the notion of wedding a brother by blood, Arsinoe knew too well the ruthless equations that governed the Ptolemaic dynasty, where royal women were born to be both pawns and players in a game that made the modern Game of Thrones look almost gentle by comparison. And so she pondered Keranos' offer under cold stars. her mind split between a mother's desperate instinct to shield her sons and a queen's relentless hunger to remain relevant in a world ruled by daggers and shifting allegiances. And she remembered that in Egypt, the marriage of siblings was not scandal, but sacred tradition, an echo of Isis and Osiris, whose union bound the cosmos together. Yet she also knew the Greeks found such unions monstrous and abomination that stained the divine order. And between these two worlds, Arsinoe balanced, caught like a dancer upon a knife's edge. For to refuse Coronos's proposal meant living as an exile, wandering from court to court, vulnerable and dependent upon the fickle charity of foreign kings. But to accept meant placing her neck beneath the blade of a man who had already proven he would spill royal blood without a second thought. And as the salt wind howled over her ship's rails, Arsinoe stared toward the Macedonian horizon, knowing that the Thunderbolt was waiting and that her decision would not merely shape her own fate, but echo through the hidden truths of the Ptolemaic dynasty for centuries to come, and it is here. As her ship cuts through black waters toward a destiny soaked in both gold and blood, that Arsinoe's journey into the most perilous union of her life begins, leading us to the fateful day when she would stand in Pella's marble halls as a bride once more, but this time to a man whose embrace would threaten to destroy everything she had ever fought to protect. When Arsinoe II at last set foot on the marble docks of Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia, where Alexander the Great himself had once learned to ride and to rule, she felt the chill of destiny brushing her skin like the breath of ghosts. For this was not merely another royal city, but a place thick with the weight of legends, a city whose columns still echoed with the footsteps of conquerors and whose very stones seemed to whisper secrets of ancient royal scandals and forbidden royal marriages. And as she ascended the palace steps, wrapped in silks that masked the terror tightening her chest, she was greeted by Ptolemy Coronos, the Thunderbolt, whose smile flashed like the blade of a dagger, and whose eyes held both desire and calculation. For here was a man who saw in Arsinoe not simply a sister but a key to legitimacy, a living link to the blood of Ptolemy the First Soter, and to Alexander's divine inheritance. And though his voice dripped with promises of safety for her sons and a throne beside him, Arsinoe read between his words and recognized the same ruthless hunger that had driven him to murder Seleucus. And yet, standing beneath the flickering light of golden oil lamps, surrounded by nobles eager to witness what they believed to be the forging of a new dynasty, Arsinoe forced herself to meet his gaze and whisper the vows that would bind her fate once more in a union woven from both blood and treachery, because she knew there was no other path left to her, for, in the brutal chessboard of the Ptolemaic dynasty, even queens could become pawns when the stakes were survival. And as priests lifted their arms to the heavens, invoking Zeus and Hera, those divine siblings whose own union was both revered and reviled, Arsinoe felt the bitter irony coil around her heart, because though she stood draped in gold and crowned with a diadem fit for a goddess, she knew she was offering herself as a shield to protect her children, hoping that blood ties might buy her sons a few precious years of life. And all the while she could sense the nobles shifting uncomfortably in their robes, torn between admiration and revulsion at a marriage that defied the boundaries of nature and morality. For even in an age steeped in dark secrets and ancient royal scandals, this union seemed to tiptoe dangerously close to sacrilege. And yet, amid the music and perfumed air, Arsinoe clung to the cold, clear thought that if she survived this night, she might yet outwit even the Thunderbolt himself. For she had learned long ago that in the world of powerful women in history, survival was never passive. It was an art of patience, deception, and ruthless precision. And it is here, as the wedding feast roared around her and golden goblets were raised high, that Arsinoe felt the invisible blade hovering above her sons' necks. And though she forced herself to smile, in her mind she was already plotting, because the true test of this forbidden royal marriage would not be found in vows or kisses, but in what would happen when the Thunderbolt finally revealed what lay behind his promises. A revelation that would explode into one of the darkest chapters in the hidden truths of the Ptolemaic dynasty, as we shall soon witness on the blood-soaked marble floors of Pella's royal palace. On the night that should have sealed her salvation, Arsinoe II lay beside Ptolemy Coronos in a royal chamber, whose marble walls glowed with the flicker of oil lamps, and as music from the fading wedding feast still echoed faintly through the palace corridors, she forced herself to lie motionless while the man who called himself both brother and husband whispered sweet words that tasted of venom. For though he had sworn before gods and nobles that her sons would be safe, and that their blood would join his own to cement the throne of Macedonia, Arsinoe felt the ancient instincts of survival prickling at her spine, warning her that the true price of this forbidden royal marriage was yet to be revealed, and it came with terrifying swiftness. Because as dawn's first pale glow bled across the horizon, soldiers loyal to Carounos stormed the royal apartments where her younger sons Lysimachus and Philip slept, wrapped in silk sheets. And in an instant the marble floors of the palace that had once rung with Alexander's footsteps were splashed red with royal blood as the boys just 15 and 12 were dragged screaming from their beds and butchered before Arsinoe's eyes, their cries echoing like curses in the cavernous halls. And in that frozen moment, Arsinoe's entire world collapsed. The promise of safety transformed into an ancient royal scandal so monstrous it would stain the Ptolemaic dynasty's legacy for generations, and though her screams ripped through the palace like a blade, the Thunderbolt merely watched her with cold triumph. For to him this was not murder but strategy, the ruthless elimination of rivals who might one day challenge his fragile claim to the throne. And as guards wiped blood from their swords, and the nobles pretended not to hear the wails of a mother who had just witnessed the annihilation of her lineage, Arsinoe felt something inside her snap. Because in the brutal Game of Thrones that was antiquity, she had learned that grief was a luxury she could no longer afford, and so as she sank to her knees amid the pools of blood, her heart breaking under the weight of loss so profound, it threatened to swallow her alive. Another part of her mind began to race, calculating escape routes, weighing alliances, planning the impossible, because though her sons lay dead at her feet, Arsinoe II was still a queen, still a woman born of the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and she refused to die as a pawn in her half-brother's cruel game. And thus, in the days that followed, as Carounos tightened his grip on power, Arsinoe began to spin a new web in silence, using loyal servants and secret passages, hiding her rage behind a mask of regal composure, and when at last the chance came, she vanished into the night, disguised as a humble servant, her jeweled diadem traded for a plain woolen scarf, leaving behind a palace now haunted by the ghosts of her children. And it is here in the darkness beyond Pella's marble gates that Arsinoe's desperate flight begins once more, as we shall see when the woman who has lost everything sets sail toward the one place where the blood of the pharaohs still might protect her, the shining, perilous shores of Alexandria. As the shadows of night wrapped Pella's marble towers, Arsinoe II slipped through secret corridors where echoes of her son's screams still lingered like ghosts in the stone. For in the aftermath of the bloodbath that had turned her wedding chamber into the stage of an ancient royal scandal, she knew that staying even a single day longer in Carounos' palace meant certain death, and so under the cover of darkness, she became a phantom, shedding her jeweled robes for a coarse woolen cloak, her royal scent of frankincense replaced by the sharp tang of sweat and fear. While in the depths of the palace, loyal servants risked their own lives to smuggle her past guards drunk on the Thunderbolt's victory, for the woman who had once commanded poets and philosophers was now a fugitive hunted across the very marble floors, where Alexander the Great himself had once run as a boy, and as she fled into the frozen Macedonian night. Every step carried the weight of forbidden royal marriages and dark secrets that were the hallmark of the Ptolemaic dynasty, for Arsinoe knew too well that her survival was more than personal. It was political, because if Carounos could parade her corpse through the streets of Pella, he would cement his throne in the eyes of nobles still wary of his bloody rise, and so Arsinoe pushed onward, driven not merely by grief but by the fierce conviction that the woman who had been forced to watch her children die would not allow their sacrifice to become meaningless, and the escape that followed became a tale whispered in royal courts for centuries for using disguises and coded messages, bribing guards with gold and silencing others with the threat of retribution. Arsinoe evaded patrols that scoured the countryside, moving from village to village under false names, sometimes as a merchant's widow, other times as a healer seeking lost herbs. While in her mind burned the same ruthless intelligence that had once guided the politics of Thrace, because she knew that in the brutal Game of Thrones of antiquity, a queen without a throne was only a target waiting to be struck down. And it was this cold knowledge that led her at last to the rugged shores of Samothrace, an island fortress whose ancient mysteries promised sanctuary to those pursued by the wrath of kings. And as she stood upon the ship's deck, wind lashing her hair, salt spray stinging her eyes, Arsinoe cast one final look back toward the horizon, where Pella lay hidden beneath winter clouds, vowing that she would return not as a pawn, but as a force to be reckoned with. And though the memories of her murdered sons threatened to hollow her from within, she forced herself to remember that in the Ptolemaic dynasty, even the deepest wounds could be turned into weapons, and it is here on the storm-tossed waters of the Aegean that Arsinoe's gaze turned south toward the gleaming lighthouse of Alexandria, for Egypt was calling her home, and the blood of pharaohs demanded that she claim her birthright, as we shall soon witness in the next chapter of her relentless quest for power and revenge. By the time Arsinoe II set foot on the wind-battered shores of Samothrace, the salt spray clinging to her hair like a crown of tears, she was no longer merely a queen in exile, but a woman forged in the crucible of ancient royal scandals, carrying within her every scar and secret that the dark corridors of the Ptolemaic dynasty had taught her. For Samothrace, with its brooding cliffs and sacred temples shrouded in mist, offered sanctuary to those fleeing the wrath of kings, and beneath the looming shadows of colossal statues dedicated to the great gods, Arsinoe knelt in whispered prayers, not merely for vengeance but for the strength to survive what lay ahead, because she knew that her journey was far from over. And as ships creaked in the harbor below, bound for every corner of the fractured Hellenistic world, Arsinoe's eyes turned inexorably toward the south to Egypt, where the towering lighthouse of Pharos cut through the sea's darkness like a spear of divine fire. Because there in Alexandria sat her brother Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, the scholar king whose rule was hailed for prosperity, but whose throne was surrounded by swirling rumors of forbidden royal marriages and hidden truths that could either save or doom a dynasty, and Arsinoe understood that to return to Egypt meant gambling everything once again. For though it was the land of her birth, it was also a court filled with vipers and watchful eyes, where a sister could be seen as a savior or as a threat to the king's fragile legitimacy. And as the priests of Samothrace offered blessings for her voyage, Arsinoe felt the weight of every choice pressing upon her shoulders, because she knew that in Egypt the very laws of the gods permitted royal siblings to wed, transforming incest from an ancient royal scandal into an act of divine symbolism. Yet she also knew the Greeks in Alexandria still whispered that such unions reeked of madness and corruption. And between these worlds, Arsinoe was poised a woman who had already sacrificed 2 of her sons on the altar of dynastic survival, and who now steeled herself to make one final monstrous bargain, for to arrive in Alexandria as a mere widow was to risk living in the shadows, her name fading into the dusty corners of history, but to return as a potential queen beside her brother was to seize the chance to turn all the dark secrets she carried into instruments of power. And so she prepared for the voyage south, gathering what little treasure she had left, instructing her remaining son Ptolemy in the delicate dance of royal appearances, and tightening her resolve like armor around her battered heart, because the hidden truths of the Ptolemaic dynasty had taught her that only those willing to embrace both love and monstrosity could carve their names into the stone of eternity, and it is here on the cusp of the churning Aegean and the promise of Egyptian shores that Arsinoe's eyes blaze with the vision of reclaiming her birthright, setting the stage for a negotiation that would not merely reunite a sister with her brother, but would shake the very foundations of royal morality and crown her once again in the dangerous light of divine power. When the sails of Arsinoe II's ship finally caught the winds sweeping down the Aegean, carrying her southward toward Alexandria's gleaming shores, she stood upon the deck wrapped in a cloak, both to shield her from the salt spray and to conceal the storm raging inside her chest, for this voyage was no mere passage home, but a return into the center of the ancient royal scandals and forbidden royal marriages that had shaped her entire existence. And as the white columns of the Pharos lighthouse rose on the horizon, blazing like a star above the restless sea, Arsinoe felt her pulse quicken, because Egypt was the land where her story had begun, and it was also the only place left on earth where a woman like her, scarred and battle-hardened by the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty, could carve out a future. And yet she knew that to walk back into the palace of her brother Ptolemy II Philadelphus was to place her head once more upon the executioner's block. For in the shimmering corridors of Alexandria, loyalty was as fragile as papyrus, and alliances shifted like the sands of the Nile. And though Ptolemy was hailed as the enlightened king-builder of libraries and patron of philosophers, Arsinoe remembered that beneath his scholar's robes beat the heart of a king who knew the lethal calculus of power, and so when her ship slipped into Alexandria's great harbor past triremes bristling with spears and cargo ships heavy with silk and ivory, she ordered her son Ptolemy to remain hidden until she could read the currents of the court, for though they were of the same blood, Arsinoe knew that even family could become executioners when the stakes were dynastic survival, and as she stepped onto the harbor stones, memories flooded her. The laughter of her childhood echoing in palace gardens, the scent of lotus blossoms drifting through sunlit colonnades, and the whisper of courtiers who once measured her worth like they measured tribute from distant provinces, and yet she forced her face into a mask of serene confidence, because she understood that appearances were everything in a world where ancient royal scandals could topple thrones, and when she entered the palace the cool marble floors seemed to hum beneath her feet, as though the spirits of generations of pharaohs were watching to see how this daughter of Ptolemy the Morsoter would play her final hand, and the reunion between brother and sister unfolded beneath ceilings painted with stars, where golden lions guarded the throne and scribes stood ready to record every word. And though Ptolemy II welcomed her with measured warmth, Arsinoe saw in his eyes the flicker of calculation, the silent question of whether his sister returned as a supplicant seeking shelter or as a rival laying claim to his crown. And in that instant she knew that words alone would not win her place, that to secure power once more, she would have to offer something bold enough to silence every whisper of scandal. And it is here in the scented shadows of Alexandria's royal palace that Arsinoe began to shape the proposition that would stun the entire Hellenistic world, a proposition that would demand she once again embrace a union forbidden and divine a marriage that would crown her not only as queen, but as a living goddess, as we shall see when Arsinoe steps into the most audacious negotiation of her extraordinary life. Inside the marble halls of Alexandria, beneath gilded ceilings painted with constellations that glimmered like the eyes of ancient gods, Arsinoe II stood before her brother, Ptolemy II. Philadelphus poised like a blade honed by years of survival in a world where ancient royal scandals and forbidden royal marriages were as common as the Nile's floodwaters. And though the courtiers hovered at a respectful distance pretending to busy themselves with papyrus scrolls and whispers of foreign trade, every gaze was fixed upon this sibling encounter, because all of Egypt sensed that the outcome of this meeting would ripple through the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty for generations to come, and as the hush thickened like incense, Arsinoe lifted her chin, eyes gleaming with the cold fire of a queen who had lost everything, and yet refused to surrender, and spoke words that would ignite both horror and admiration across the Hellenistic world. For she proposed not mere refuge nor the quiet life of a royal widow, but a marriage between brother and sister, a union that would transform them into living embodiments of divine order, echoing the sacred marriage of Isis and Osiris. And though such a proposition might have seemed an abomination to Greek sensibilities to the priests of Egypt, it was the ultimate affirmation of cosmic balance. And Arsinoe knew that by invoking the gods she could seize a power that transcended mortal politics, because she understood that in the brutal Game of Thrones of antiquity, only those who dared the unthinkable could carve their names into eternity. And as her words fell like stones into the silent chamber, Ptolemy II studied her with eyes both wary and intrigued, because he too grasped the brilliance of her strategy, for to marry his sister was to drape himself in the divine mantle of the pharaohs, to prove to both Greek subjects and Egyptian priests that the Ptolemaic dynasty was not merely a foreign dynasty ruling the two lands, but true heirs to the divine kingship of the pharaohs. And yet, as murmurs rose among the nobles, Arsinoe could almost taste the fear and scandal rippling through the room, for even in Alexandria, where temples thrived and scholars debated the nature of the cosmos, there were lines which once crossed could never be uncrossed, and she saw in Ptolemy's furrowed brow the calculation of a king weighing the risk of outrage against the prize of absolute legitimacy. And though the chamber felt frozen in time, Arsinoe pressed her advantage, reminding him in a voice as soft as silk, yet edged with steel, that together they could become not merely rulers, but living gods, the Theoi Philadelphoi, the sibling-loving deities whose portraits would grace temples, coins, and monuments for centuries. And in that moment, beneath the flicker of torchlight and the heavy scent of lotus blossoms, Arsinoe wagered everything on a single audacious move because she knew that in the dangerous dance of royal negotiations, victory belonged not to the timid, but to those who dared redefine the limits of power. And it is here, as Ptolemy's eyes glimmered with the first glint of agreement, that Arsinoe felt the tide of destiny surge around her, carrying her toward a divine marriage that would enshrine her as both queen and goddess, as we shall witness in the ceremony that would forever reshape the throne of Egypt and seal her name among the most powerful women in history. So it was that in the sacred heart of Egypt, amid temples older than memory and gods whose names were whispered for 3,000 years, Arsinoe II ascended to a place no woman before her had dared to claim so boldly for the negotiations between her and Ptolemy II. Philadelphus culminated in a ceremony that would shake the pillars of both Greek and Egyptian worlds, and as the sun rose like molten gold over the limestone walls of Memphis, the ancient capital where pharaohs had been crowned since the dawn of time, drums thundered and conch shells wailed their eerie notes, summoning nobles, priests, and foreign envoys to witness what would become one of history's most audacious acts of royal reinvention. And Arsinoe, robed in linen as white as the cresting waves of the Nile, adorned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, stepped into the great temple of Ptah, her every movement a study in calculated majesty, because she understood that this day was more than a wedding. It was the forging of a new reality where ancient royal scandals and forbidden royal marriages would be recast, not as shame, but as symbols of divine legitimacy, and the scent of frankincense and lotus blossoms swirled around her like an invisible cloak, as high priests chanted hymns older than the pyramids, their voices echoing beneath columns carved with hieroglyphs that spoke of cosmic balance and royal destiny. And beside her stood Ptolemy II, draped in the regalia of a living god, his crook and flail gleaming in the torchlight. And though the Greek nobles in attendance watched with barely concealed horror at the sight of a brother and sister taking vows before gods and men, Arsinoe felt only a fierce exhilaration, for in this moment she was not merely a queen or a survivor of the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She was becoming a goddess, the embodiment of Isis joined to her Osiris. And as priests poured sacred water over their joined hands and recited texts older than the city of Athens itself, Arsinoe gazed out across the assembled throng and saw not shock, but awe beginning to take root in their eyes, for she had turned scandal into sanctity, forbidden love into cosmic order, and it was then beneath the towering statues of gods whose eyes seemed to blaze with approval that the royal couple were proclaimed Theoi Philadelphoi, the sibling-loving gods, an announcement that would ripple through temples, marketplaces, and distant kingdoms, reshaping Egypt's identity and solidifying Arsinoe's place among the most powerful queens of history. And though the Greeks still murmured of ancient royal scandal and the moral collapse of dynasties, the Egyptian priests hailed her as a divine queen, who would ensure the harmony of the two lands, and coins soon bore her image alongside her brothers, adorned with crowns and inscriptions declaring them both mortal rulers and immortal deities. And in that shimmering moment, Arsinoe knew that all her pain, her sacrifices, the blood she had shed, and the betrayals she had endured had led her to this throne where mortals knelt and gods took notice. And it is here, in the triumphant roar of the crowd and the silent reverence of the sacred chambers, that Arsinoe resolved to wield this new power, not merely for herself, but to cement a dynasty whose shadow would stretch all the way to Cleopatra, as we shall soon see when the newly crowned goddess steps into her role as co-ruler, determined to reshape Egypt's destiny with a will as unbreakable as the stone from which her temples were built. With the echoes of hymns still resonating through Memphis's temple precincts and the scent of lotus and burning myrrh clinging to her silken robes, Arsinoe II stepped into her new role not merely as queen, but as divine co-ruler. And in the weeks that followed the sacred marriage, the palaces of Alexandria buzzed like a hive with speculation. Admiration and hidden fear, for Egypt had never seen a queen like her. a woman who had turned ancient royal scandal and forbidden royal marriages into weapons of legitimacy, who carried herself with the cold precision of a strategist, yet spoke in a voice that could stir loyalty in soldiers and poets alike. And though the Greek nobles still whispered about incest and the moral decay of dynasties, Arsinoe swept through the corridors of power like a storm cloaked in perfume, for she understood better than any ruler that power was not merely seized, it was performed, and so she orchestrated grand appearances alongside Ptolemy II, riding in gilded chariots through the streets of Alexandria, while crowds threw garlands of flowers and priests hailed them as Theoi Philadelphoi, sibling-loving gods, whose union guaranteed the cosmic balance of Egypt. And under her direction new temples rose with walls inscribed in hieroglyphs declaring Arsinoe not only as queen, but as divine protectress of the two lands, her image carved beside Isis, her names woven into prayers sung by priests who had once served pharaohs buried beneath the sands of Saqqara. And yet behind the incense and gold, Arsinoe was working a subtler magic, for she knew the true Game of Thrones in antiquity was played in whispered councils and private chambers, and she made herself indispensable to Ptolemy's rule, advising him on foreign policy alliances and the delicate management of a kingdom where Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and countless other peoples coexisted under a single crown. And it was Arsinoe who understood the power of narrative in shaping empires, commissioning poets like Theocritus to write verses comparing her divine marriage to the love of Zeus, and Hera, transforming the scandal of sibling union into a story of cosmic destiny, and on coins struck in gleaming silver, her profile appeared crowned with the double diadem beside her brothers, a visual manifesto that declared to the world that Egypt was ruled by gods incarnate. And while foreign envoys struggled to understand how a queen could wield such open authority, Arsinoe moved deftly among diplomats, securing alliances that checked the ambitions of rivals like the Seleucid Empire and ensuring Egypt's borders remained strong. And it was she who whispered wisdom into the ears of young Ptolemy III, preparing him for a future in which survival depended not on birth alone, but on cunning vision and the willingness to strike first when enemies gathered. And even as she basked in temples where incense curled around pillars older than Athens, Arsinoe never forgot the cost of her crown. The blood of sons lost, the weight of betrayals endured, and she resolved that her legacy would not merely be as queen or goddess, but as the woman who taught the Ptolemaic dynasty how to wield the dark secrets of power without being consumed by them. And it is here in the glittering courts of Alexandria, as statues rise in her honor, and scribes immortalize her name, that Arsinoe begins to contemplate not only the future of Egypt, but the price of immortality itself, as we shall soon see in the final chapters of her extraordinary reign, where triumph and tragedy would once again walk side by side. As the years unspooled like silk across the sunlit courtyards of Alexandria, Arsinoe II, now in her 40s, ruled beside Ptolemy II, with a presence that eclipsed even the towering obelisks of the city she had once fled as a frightened bride. For though the marriage of brother and sister still simmered as an ancient royal scandal in the minds of many Greeks among the Egyptians, Arsinoe had transformed herself into a living goddess, whose name was sung in temples alongside Isis and whose likeness glowed from coins carried as far afield as the markets of Rhodes and the courts of Antioch. And yet beneath the festivals, the hymns and the carefully staged ceremonies of divine rule. Arsinoe felt the relentless ticking of mortality whispering through the palace corridors, because even for queens who survived forbidden royal marriages and the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty, time remained the one adversary no cunning could defeat. And in the quiet hours of dawn, when the red sun spilled across the columns of her audience hall, Arsinoe would sometimes pause, eyes lingering on the statues of her father Ptolemy the Fun, and of Alexander, whose empire had birthed both glory and endless wars. For she knew that her reign was more than personal triumph. It was a fragile bastion against chaos, a shield for a dynasty that balanced atop a knife's edge. And she understood that to secure Egypt's future, she must guide not only policy and ritual, but the delicate question of succession. Because Ptolemy II's heirs were children of his first marriage, and though Arsinoe had woven careful bonds of loyalty and affection around her stepson, The future Ptolemy III, she knew too well how swiftly dynastic unity could fracture into conspiracies and civil war, and so she worked tirelessly behind the scenes, hosting private councils where generals and scholars gathered under flickering lamplight, where maps of the Mediterranean sprawled across marble tables and the shifting alliances of rival kings were dissected with surgical precision. And in these councils, Arsinoe's voice carried not as a consort, but as a sovereign, for she had witnessed thrones fall because rulers failed to anticipate betrayal, and she taught her stepson that power lay not merely in armies or gold, but in controlling the narrative, in transforming ancient royal scandals into tales of divine destiny, in projecting a vision so powerful that even enemies hesitated to strike, and under her guidance Egypt expanded its influence, securing victories in the First Syrian War and fortifying trade routes that flooded Alexandria's markets with spices, silks, and jewels. And yet even as she built temples and patronized poets who cast her as the mortal reflection of goddesses, Arsinoe never forgot the shadows trailing her steps, the ghosts of her murdered sons, the betrayals that had cost her both kingdoms and family. And in her deepest heart, she wondered whether the price of her crown had been not merely blood, but the surrender of her very humanity. And it is here, as the silver strands of age begin to weave through her ebony hair, that Arsinoe contemplates how to leave behind not merely a reign, but a legacy strong enough to withstand the storms that she knows must one day come, a question that will reach its haunting climax in the twilight of her life, as we shall see when death comes for the queen who once transformed herself into a living goddess. In the final years of her life, Arsinoe II, whose name once struck fear and awe across courts from Thrace to Alexandria, found herself caught between the shimmering veneer of divine queenship and the inescapable shadows of mortality. For though she still walked through marble halls perfumed with frankincense and flanked by priests who called her goddess, she felt her body growing frailer, her breath shorter, and the weight of decades of survival pressing upon bones that had carried the burdens of ancient royal scandals, forbidden royal marriages, and the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And in the stillness of her private chambers, as moonlight spilled across alabaster statues of the gods who had witnessed her every triumph and tragedy, Arsinoe would sometimes press her fingers to her temples, feeling the throb of memories crowding her mind. Memories of a terrified bride in Sardis, of a queen in Thrace playing a deadly chess game for her children's survival, of a woman fleeing blood-soaked corridors in Pella, while soldiers hunted her through the night, and most vividly of all, of the sacred temple in Memphis, where she had dared to redefine power itself by marrying her own brother, transforming ancient royal scandal into the very essence of divine legitimacy. And though poets still sang her praises and coins still bore her profile crowned with the double diadem, Arsinoe knew that the same nobles who now knelt before her would one day whisper eagerly about the fall of the woman who had once ruled like a living goddess, for history was merciless, and she feared that all she had built could unravel with her final breath. And so in these twilight days, she dedicated herself with relentless focus to securing the dynasty's future, summoning her stepson, the future Ptolemy III, to council after council, drilling into him the lessons written in her own blood, that survival demanded not merely force of arms, but the power to shape narratives, to turn even the foulest rumors into instruments of rule, to cloak ambition in divine imagery. And as her voice grew weaker, Arsinoe's mind remained as sharp as the dagger she once concealed in her robes, for she knew that the true test of her reign would not be written in the temples or the festivals, but in whether the dynasty she had preserved could withstand the storms she sensed gathering on the horizon, and in the sacred hush of the palace's inner sanctuaries, where only the highest priests were permitted to tread. Arsinoe ordered the establishment of a cult in her own honor, ensuring that even after her mortal body turned to dust, her name would be invoked in prayers and offerings, and statues would stand in sanctuaries proclaiming her as Arsinoe Philadelphus, the divine sister wife who had safeguarded Egypt. And though some condemned this as hubris, Arsinoe knew it was the only shield powerful enough to guard her legacy against the erosion of time. Because in a world ruled by ancient royal scandals and shifting alliances, immortality was the only true defense against oblivion. And it is here, as the flickering lamplight paints her features in gold and shadow, that Arsinoe contemplates the final paradox of her existence, that to save her people and her bloodline, she had surrendered her humanity to become a goddess, a truth that would echo through the centuries until another queen named Cleopatra would stand upon the same marble floors and wonder whether the price of power was worth the sacrifice of one's soul, a question we shall ponder as we draw closer to the closing pages of Arsinoe's immortal story. So it was that in the year 270, BCE Arsinoe II, the queen who had survived kingdoms crumbling around her, who had turned ancient royal scandals and forbidden royal marriages into instruments of divine power, who had witnessed the slaughter of her own children, and yet risen again to wear the double crown of Egypt, breathed her last beneath the coffered ceilings of Alexandria's palace, and as the final exhale slipped from her lips, the marble halls seemed to hold their breath for the passing of a woman who had once been bride, queen, mother, fugitive, and finally goddess, marked not only the end of a life, but the closing of an era whose echoes would ripple through the dark secrets of the Ptolemaic dynasty for centuries to come. And while the people of Alexandria wept, and priests chanted hymns older than the pyramids, Arsinoe's funeral procession wound through streets flooded with mourners beneath banners of gold and crimson, while scholars, merchants, soldiers, and scribes all came to pay homage to the woman who had reshaped Egypt's destiny. For though her life had been forged in blood and betrayal, Arsinoe had achieved something that transcended mere survival. She had laid the very foundations of a new model of queenship, transforming the queen from pawn into sovereign, from trophy wife into co-ruler, and though poets immortalized her as a goddess, the truth of her legacy lay deeper in the ruthlessness with which she played the Game of Thrones of antiquity, in the brilliance with which she wielded propaganda, in the sheer audacity of her divine marriage that turned scandal into legitimacy. And even as her sarcophagus was lowered into the royal tombs, the priests proclaimed her Arsinoe Philadelphus, the divine sister wife whose spirit would continue to guard the two lands her name etched into temple walls and whispered in prayers. And across the Mediterranean, kings and queens took note, for Arsinoe had shown that power could be claimed even by those born female in a world of men, that survival could be forged from the very chains meant to bind, and that the dark secrets of royal houses could be transmuted into unassailable thrones, and her influence did not die with her mortal flesh, for generations of queens, none more famous than Cleopatra herself, would look to Arsinoe as the blueprint for ruling in a realm where beauty, intelligence, and ruthlessness must walk hand in hand, and the practice of royal sibling marriages, once a taboo whispered in scandal, became the defining feature of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a strategy that bound bloodlines and divine authority so tightly that even Rome in all its power would one day struggle to unravel it. And yet in the quiet spaces between legend and reality, there lingers the haunting question of whether Arsinoe, the woman who became a goddess, ever found peace for the human heart that beat beneath the gold and diadems. For in seeking to preserve her children and her lineage, she had sacrificed her own humanity, and the price of her crown had been paid in the currency of blood tears and the loss of self. And it is this paradox that ensures her immortality, not merely as a queen of Egypt, but as a timeless symbol of how, in the relentless tides of history, even those who seem doomed to be pawns can rise to become queens or even gods. A truth that continues to captivate us today as we gaze back across the centuries, hungry for the hidden truths, the dark secrets, and the fierce, indomitable spirit of powerful queens of history who refused to be forgotten. And so, as we stand here at the end of Arsinoe's extraordinary journey from pawn to queen, from mortal woman to living goddess, we're left with a question that echoes far beyond the marble halls of ancient palaces in a world that constantly tries to define us. Do we surrender to the roles others impose, or do we dare, like Arsinoe, to rewrite our own story, no matter the cost? Because the truth lurking beneath every ancient royal scandal and dark secret of the Ptolemaic dynasty is this: power doesn't belong to those who were born with it. It belongs to those who refuse to be erased. And maybe that's the real lesson Arsinoe leaves us, that survival is not just about staying alive. It's about transforming pain into purpose, betrayal into brilliance, and chains into crowns. If her story has lit even a spark of that defiance in you, don't let it fade. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of Arsinoe's journey hit you the hardest, or where in the world you're watching from, because I love knowing how far these stories travel. Smash that like button, save this video so you can revisit the hidden truths of powerful queens of history, and make sure you subscribe, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. After all, history is the ultimate Game of Thrones, and together we're here to uncover every secret it's tried to hide.